The airplane gate was crowded, people rushing, sighing, bumping shoulders as they dragged their luggage. It was one of those long days when everyone seemed tired and impatient. Families struggled with children, business people tapped on their phones, and the line moved slowly forward toward the narrow door of the plane. In the middle of all this stood Denzel, a quiet man in his mid-40s. He was not famous, not rich, just a simple worker who had saved for months to visit his family. His clothes were plain, his shoes a little worn, and his bag looked old but neatly packed. As he walked down the jet bridge, he kept his head slightly lowered, hoping not to disturb anyone. When he stepped into the plane, the air already felt heavy. People were pushing to get to their seats faster. Some grumbled when others blocked. The aisle too long, Denzel moved carefully, looking at the seat numbers above. His seat was far back near the window. He smiled nervously to himself, thinking he would soon sit and relax. But as he made his way, whispers began. A pair of teenagers giggled, pointing at his bag. A man in a suit smirked at his faded jacket. It was small, but Denzel could hear. Every step he took made him feel smaller. His heart pounded faster. He told himself to ignore it, to just reach his seat. Finally, he reached the row. He tried to lift his bag into the overhead bin, but the bag was heavier than it looked. His arms shook as he raised it, just as he was almost done. A tall passenger pushed past him, shoving the bag aside with one strong motion. The man said loudly, "There's no room for junk, put it under your seat." Laughter broke out from a few nearby passengers. Denzel froze, his face turned red. His lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. He gave a small nod, murmured, "Sorry," and lowered the bag again. He bent down awkwardly, sliding it under the seat. His knees bumped against the seat in front of him, but he stayed silent. The laughter still echoed in his ears. The flight attendant walked by at that moment. She glanced at the scene but didn't say anything. Her eyes slid away, pretending she hadn't noticed. Denzel's chest tightened. He had hoped maybe someone would tell the rude passenger to stop, but no one did. He felt invisible, as if he didn't belong there. He sat down carefully, pressing himself against the window side, his hands folded on his lap, his shoulders hunched. He tried to disappear into the seat. His mind was filled with embarrassment, replaying the laughter. He thought of his family waiting for him. He didn't want them to know how small he felt here. He stared out the tiny window, watching the workers on the ground move around the plane. Meanwhile, the other passengers continued with their lives. The man in the suit leaned back, satisfied. The teenagers whispered and laughed at something on their phone. Nobody thought of the quiet man by the window. Nobody cared how heavy that small humiliation felt in his chest. But not everyone was blind. A few rows ahead, hidden under a baseball cap, another passenger had been watching. His face calm, his eyes sharp. He had seen the whispers, the shove, the laughter. He had noticed the way Denzel shrank back into his seat like a shadow. That passenger was Keanu Reeves, but for now, no one realized it. Denzel, however, had no idea he was being watched. He pressed his forehead lightly against the cool glass, trying to breathe slowly, trying to stop the shaking in his hands. His thoughts swirled with self-doubt. Why did they laugh? Why didn't the staff help? Why was kindness so rare? The flight hadn't even started and already he felt broken. Around him, the airplane buzzed with activity, passengers adjusting their seatbelts, overhead bins slamming shut, announcements echoing from the speakers. But for Denzel, the world felt far away. The humiliation weighed on him like a heavy stone. He told himself he should be used to it by now. He had faced quiet insults before, at shops, on buses, even at work. Still, it hurt every time. Still, it left scars no one could see. As the engines roared to life, he closed his eyes and whispered a small prayer under his breath. He prayed for the flight to end quickly, for the journey to be quiet, for the eyes of strangers to turn away. He didn't know that something far greater was about to happen. He didn't know that this painful moment, witnessed by the right pair of eyes, would soon change everything, not only for him, but for the entire flight. The airplane was in the air now, the cabin lights dimmed. The soft hum of the engines filled the space. Most passengers had settled down. Some were flipping through magazines, Others were already trying to sleep. But for Denzel, the humiliation still burned inside him. He sat stiff in his seat, staring at his hands, trying to make himself invisible. When the flight attendant started moving down the aisle with the drink cart, people perked up. A man in a suit asked for wine. A woman requested juice. Children shouted for soda. The attendant smiled, nodding, handing out drinks quickly. Everyone seemed cheerful when they received what they asked for. Everyone, except Denzel. When the cart reached his row, Denzel raised his hand slightly. His voice was soft, almost shaking as he asked, "Can I please have some water?" The attendant, a young woman with a forced smile, barely looked at him. She muttered something under her breath, then handed water to the passenger next to him instead. Denzel thought maybe she hadn't heard him, so he asked again, a little louder this time. "Water, please." The attendant sighed, rolled her eyes and said, "We'll see if there's any left later." Her tone was sharp, dismissive, like he had asked for something impossible. The passengers nearby heard her words. Some snickered. One man leaned toward his friend and whispered loudly enough. Maybe he should learn how to travel properly before asking for service. They both laughed, shaking their heads as if Denzel was some kind of joke. Denzel felt his throat dry up. He leaned back in his seat, trying not to show his disappointment. He didn't want to give them more reason to laugh. His cheeks were hot again. His chest ached, he thought. Why was it so hard to just be treated kindly? It was just water, nothing more, yet it felt like he had asked for too much. The teenagers from earlier noticed too. One pulled out a phone and pretended to record him, whispering things that made the other giggle. Denzel turned his face toward the window. His reflection stared back at him, tired and broken. He wished the flight would just end. He wished he could be anywhere but here. The atmosphere around him grew colder. The humiliation was no longer just about the bag. It was now about him as a person. They saw him as less, as unworthy, and no one stopped it. The attendants didn't step in. The laughing passengers didn't stop. It was as if the whole plane agreed silently that he was different, that he didn't deserve respect. Inside, Denzel fought with his feelings. A small part of him wanted to stand up, to speak, to shout that he was human just like them. But fear chained him down. He thought of his family, of his children waiting for him. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want to be dragged off a plane and make the news for the wrong reason. So he stayed quiet, swallowing the bitterness with each breath. But not everyone was blind. A few rows ahead, under that baseball cap, Keanu Reeves sat still. His calm eyes had been following the entire scene. From the moment Denzel asked for water to the way the attendant dismissed him, Keanu's jaw tightened. His hand rested on the armrest, tapping lightly. He was a man known for patience, for quiet humility. But in that moment, his patience was being tested. Passengers near Keanu hadn't recognized him yet. To them, he was just another man traveling alone. But if they had looked closely, they would have seen the sharp focus in his eyes. He wasn't just watching, he was deciding. He couldn't believe how openly cruel people could be. He couldn't believe the staff allowed it. He thought of all the moments in his own life when he had been overlooked, when kindness could have made a difference. Meanwhile, Denzel kept shrinking deeper into his seat. His lips pressed together, his throat dry. He closed his eyes, pretending to rest, but his heart raced. He thought maybe he had done something wrong. Maybe he didn't look right. Maybe he didn't belong among these people. That thought hurt the most. That he didn't belong. The laughter slowly faded as people got busy with their drinks. The attendants moved on with the cart. But the memory of those sharp words stayed heavy in the air. It was no longer just an accident. It was cruelty, pure and simple. And it was, seen by more people than the ones laughing. Keanu leaned back, silent for now, but his mind was firm. He knew what he had to do. This flight was not going to continue like this. He was not going to let a man be humiliated while he sat by and watched. He was already preparing for the moment to act. For now, the cabin was quiet again. But beneath that quiet, a storm was gathering, and Denzel, with his eyes still closed, had no idea that his life was about to change because one stranger refused to let the cruelty continue. He had no idea that the flight he wished would end quickly would instead become the story that shook the entire airline. The plane floated steady in the sky, the cabin lights dim, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Most passengers had gone back to their own business, reading, watching movies, or sipping their drinks. Yet one man sat in silence, watching. His name was Keanu Reeves, and though most of the people around him had not noticed who he was, his eyes were sharp, his heart heavy. Keanu had seen the bag being pushed aside earlier. He had seen the laughter that followed. He had seen the way Denzel folded into himself like a man trying to disappear, and now he had just witnessed the cruel way the attendant brushed Denzel off when he only asked for water. It was such a simple request, so small, yet even that had been denied to him with mocking words. Keanu knew this was not right. He had traveled countless times. He had seen stress and rude behavior. But what was happening here was different. This was open humiliation. Denzel, the quiet man by the window, did not even realize he was being watched. He kept his head low, eyes on the glass beside him. His reflection looked back at him. Tired eyes, sunken cheeks, lips pressed in silence. He wanted to forget the moment, but the sting stayed inside him. His mind whispered cruel thoughts, that maybe he did not belong here, that maybe he was nothing more than what the others saw. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat. He wore no fancy clothes, just a simple jacket and cap, blending in, people around. Him had no idea they sat beside a man famous for his kindness as much as his acting. But Keanu was not thinking about his image. He was thinking about what was right. He had lived long enough to know silence was dangerous. When people stayed quiet, cruelty only grew stronger. From where he sat, he could see Denzel's hands trembling faintly in his lap. The man kept rubbing his palms against his knees, trying to calm himself. That small gesture spoke louder than words. Keanu felt his chest tighten. He had seen people fight with swords on movie sets, but this kind of fight, the one inside a man's heart when he tried not to break, was much harder. Around them, the flight attendants continued their work as if nothing had happened. They smiled at others, offered snacks, leaned close to speak politely to passengers in better clothes. Their eyes never once returned to Denzel. It was as if he had vanished from their world, just another body in a seat. Keanu thought about how dangerous that kind of blindness was, how easy it was for people to look away from pain when it was not their own. Keanu's thoughts wandered for a moment. He remembered his own struggles, the times he had faced loss, loneliness, and quiet disrespect. He remembered sitting alone on subway rides, no one recognizing him, no one caring. He remembered how one kind word from a stranger could lift a weight from his chest. That memory fueled him now. He knew how much difference it would make for Denzel to know he was not alone. Meanwhile, Denzel closed his eyes pretending to rest. But inside his mind was loud. He replayed the shove, the laughter, the cruel words about junk, and now the sting of being refused water. He told himself not to cry, not here, not in front of strangers. He had worked too hard, lived through too much, to let strangers see his tears, yet deep down, he wished just one person would see him, really see him and say he mattered. Keanu leaned forward slightly. He could hear the quiet breathing of the passengers around him, the rustle of plastic cups, the distant cry of a baby a few rows back. But none of it distracted him. His eyes stayed locked on Denzel. He was studying the man's pain like a book. Every detail mattered. Every silence told a story. The plane jolted slightly in turbulence. Some passengers gasped, some laughed nervously. But Denzel didn't move. He stayed frozen, his hands gripping, the armrest tight. Keanu noticed this too. He saw how the man held himself together even when the world shook around him. That strength, that quiet endurance only deepened Keanu's respect for him. As the minutes passed, Keanu's decision grew clearer. He could not let this continue. He was a man who believed in action, not just words. He had built his life on choosing kindness when the world expected coldness. He knew that when he stood, people would listen, not because of his fame, but because truth carried power. But for now, he remained still, waiting for the right moment, letting the anger settle into something firm, something unshakable. He wanted to act in a way that would not just comfort Denzel but also teach everyone in that cabin a lesson they would never forget. Denzel sat unaware of all this, unaware that just a few rows away someone had already chosen to stand for him. He thought he was alone. He thought his pain was his own to carry. He could not imagine that the man in the jacket and cap, the one who looked so ordinary, was about to change everything. The plane hummed on through the clouds, calm on the outside, but inside, in the quiet hearts of two men, one broken, one watching, something powerful was building. The world had tried to make Denzel invisible, but fate had placed the right witness in the right seat, and soon that witness would turn silence into a storm. The airplane glided smoothly through the clouds. The cabin was quiet, yet under that quietness, tension lived like a shadow. Passengers leaned back in their seats, sipping drinks, flipping through channels on the small screens. Some laughed at movies. Some whispered to each other. For them, it was an ordinary flight. For Denzel, it was anything but ordinary. He sat pressed against the window, his shoulders tight. He tried to look outside, but all he saw was the blur of clouds. His thoughts were louder than the hum of the engines, the bag being shoved, the mocking laughter, the refusal of water. They replayed again and again, each memory heavier than the last. He breathed slowly, telling himself to stay calm, but his chest ached. His lips were dry, his throat burned, and still, no one cared. When the attendant passed again, Denzel lowered his eyes. He didn't dare ask for water now. He feared another insult, another laugh. His stomach knotted. He thought about home, about how different it felt to be among people who loved him. He wondered why kindness was so rare here, why a stranger's journey had to be filled with cruelty. Around him, voices carried small, sharp words. A man whispered to his friend, "Look at him, acting so pitiful." The friend chuckled, not caring if Denzel heard. The teenagers giggled again. One nudged the other, pointing at Denzel's shoes, worn at the edges. Their laughter stung worse than words. It was not just about what they said. It was about how little they saw him as human. Denzel clenched his fists hidden on his lap. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to vanish into the seat and never be noticed again. But at the same time, a small voice in his heart whispered for someone to help, someone to remind him he was not worthless. He kept that voice buried, afraid it was too much to hope for. From a few rows away, Keanu Reeves sat still, his cap still low, but his eyes sharper than ever. He had watched long enough to understand. This was not a single moment of rudeness. It was a pattern. It was cruelty dressed as casual jokes. It was a system of silence where attendants ignored, passengers mocked, and one man carried all the pain. Keanu could feel his patience burning down to its last edge. The plane swayed gently, lights flickering for a second. Gasps rose from a few passengers but quickly died down when the captain announced calm skies ahead. Denzel's grip on the armrest tightened, his breathing fastened for a moment. Keanu saw it all. He saw the way the man held fear and humiliation inside like a storm no one else wanted to see. The drink cart rolled back up the aisle. This time, the attendant smiled wide as she poured wine for the man in the suit. She laughed politely. When the teenagers asked for extra snacks, her tone was soft, pleasant, respectful. When her eyes brushed past Denzel, the smile vanished. Her hand skipped his row as if he was invisible. Whispers rose again. One passenger muttered, "Maybe they don't serve people like him." Another chuckled. The sound cut into Denzel like knives. His chest felt heavy. He wanted to shout, but fear held him. He thought if he made a scene, he would be blamed. They would say he was the problem. He knew the world too well to think otherwise. So he stayed silent, swallowing the pain once more. But Keanu, sitting just ahead, no longer thought. Silence was an option. His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed once against the seat. He had been patient, waiting, studying, hoping it would stop. But now he knew it would not stop, not unless someone made it stop. He glanced around the cabin. at the laughing faces, at the attendants. Pretending nothing was wrong, he felt anger rise. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that is steady, unshakable, righteous. He leaned back, drawing a slow breath. He thought carefully. He could not just speak for the sake of speaking. He had to make every word strike. He had to make them see. He had to remind them that every person, no matter how simple or poor or quiet, deserved respect. Denzel shifted in his seat. His eyes, closed now, his mind begged for escape. He thought maybe if he slept, he could wake up and the humiliation would feel smaller. But sleep did not come. His thoughts kept him awake, burning with shame and loneliness. The air inside the cabin grew heavier, not because of the altitude, but because of the silence of bystanders. Everyone saw, everyone knew, but no one cared to act. That was what made the cruelty sharper. It wasn't just the laughter of a few. It was the silence of the many. Keanu's eyes stayed locked on the man by the window. He felt the weight of the choice pressing on him. He was a stranger, yes, but he was also a witness, and sometimes, being a witness meant you had to become a voice. He told himself that he would not leave this flight without doing something, without showing this man and everyone else what true humanity looked like. For now, the engines roared steady. The flight continued, but beneath the calm, something powerful was about to break. The passengers didn't know it yet. Denzel didn't know it yet. But Keanu was ready. For now, the engines roared steady. The flight continued. But beneath the calm, something powerful was about to break. The passengers didn't know it yet. Denzel didn't know it yet. But Keanu was ready to turn quiet, watching into a voice that would shake the entire cabin. The cabin was quiet except for the steady hum of the engines. People relaxed into their seats, sipping drinks, watching small screens, chatting softly, to anyone else. It seemed like a normal flight, but for Denzel the air was heavy. He sat small against the window, his shoulders hunched, his hands twisted together in his lap, his throat burned with thirst. But more than that, his heart ached from the humiliation he had suffered. He felt like the whole world had turned against him. Keanu Reeves, a few rows ahead, had been silent too long. His patience was gone. His chest tightened every time he remembered the way the attendant dismissed Denzel, the way passengers laughed, the way silence spread like poison. Keanu's mind was clear now. He could not let this continue. He could not let the man by the window drown in shame while others drank and laughed freely. Slowly, Keanu pushed back, his seatbelt, and stood. The movement was quiet, but even so it caught eyes. A tall figure rising in the middle of the cabin always drew attention. He stood firm, his cap still low, but his voice when it came was calm, steady, and filled with power. "Excuse me," he said, his tone strong enough to carry down the aisle, "but I have a question." The cabin fell into sudden silence. The drink cart paused. The flight attendant, the same one who had brushed off Denzel, turned. Her fake smile faded when she met Keanu's gaze. Something about his calm presence made her shift uneasily. Passengers craned their necks, some already whispering, "Is that Keanu Reeves?" The name spread like a spark in dry grass, but Keanu didn't care about being recognized. His eyes moved back toward Denzel, then returned to the attendant. "Why?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Was this man refused water? The words cut through the cabin, simple yet impossible to ignore. The attendant stammered, I didn't mean..." But Keanu raised a hand gently, not angrily, but firmly. "I watched," he said. "I saw you serve everyone else. I saw you smile, laugh, give wine and juice, but when he asked for water, you dismissed him loudly, rudely, like he didn't deserve it. Why?" Passengers shifted in their seats. Some glanced at Denzel, seeing him properly for the first time. The teenagers lowered their phones. The man in the suit cleared his throat awkwardly. The silence was thick. No one laughing now. Denzel sat frozen. His mouth parted slightly. He couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't believe a stranger was speaking for him. His chest rose and fell quickly. His eyes stung. For the first time since the flight began, he felt like he was not alone. The attendant flushed red, words tumbling clumsily. "It was a mistake, I didn't mean—" But Keanu's steady gaze held her in place. He did not shout, he did not insult, he simply spoke truth. And truth in that moment was heavier than anger. "Respect should never be a mistake," he said. His words fell like stones in still water, sending ripples through every heart in the cabin. Another attendant hurried over, nervous now. She offered a bottle of water quickly, trying to ease the tension. Keanu didn't move to take it. He shook his head and said, "Not for me. For him." He pointed gently toward Denzel. The bottle was handed over. Denzel's shaking hands accepted it slowly, his eyes wide, lips trembling as he whispered, "Thank you." But Keanu wasn't finished. He turned slightly, addressing the cabin. His voice was calm but filled with something that demanded attention. "Why is it so easy to laugh at someone, to mock someone who only wanted to fly home like the rest of you?" His eyes swept the passengers. "Why is it so easy to stay silent when a man is humiliated?" No one answered. No one dared. Faces lowered. Eyes turned away. The man in the suit fidgeted. The teenagers bit their lips. The same people who laughed now felt shame like fire against their skin. Keanu nodded slowly. "Kindness costs nothing," he said, "but cruelty can destroy someone's spirit. We all share this flight, this journey. And yet some of you decided he was less. That is not who we should be." His voice softened, but the weight of his words remained heavy in the air. Denzel clutched the bottle of water. His chest shook as tears filled his eyes. He tried to hide them, but he couldn't. Not this time. He felt the kindness like a light breaking through storm clouds. A stranger had spoken when no one else dared, and that stranger's words had lifted a burden he had carried for so long. The cabin stayed silent, not out of boredom but out of awe. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing their own guilt. Others nodded slowly, touched by the truth they had just heard. The attendants looked down, ashamed. Keanu sat back down quietly, not needing applause, not needing thanks. He simply leaned back, his eyes still calm. He had not spoken for fame. He had not spoken to be noticed. He had spoken because it was right. For Denzel, everything changed in that moment. The humiliation no longer crushed him. Instead, he felt seen, defended, valued. He glanced at Keanu, his lips forming a quiet thank you once again. And for the first time in a long time, he believed he mattered. The engines roared on, the flight continued, but nothing in that cabin was the same. One man's voice had shifted the weight of silence into something powerful. One man had shown what humanity truly looked like. The cabin was still heavy with silence after Keanu's words. His calm voice had struck deeper than shouting ever could. The passengers sat uneasy, eyes lowered. Some fiddled with seatbelts, some stared at the screens in front of them, but none of them could shake what they had just witnessed. Denzel sat quietly by the window, clutching the small bottle of water in his hands as if it were a lifeline. His heart still raced, but now it raced with something new, something warmer. The flight attendants, however, were shaken in a different way. The young woman who had brushed Denzel off stood frozen near the cart, her face pale, her lips trembling. She had been rude before without consequence. Passengers often let it pass, but now she had been called out publicly, and not just by anyone. By Keanu Reeves. People were whispering his name. Phones were already in hands, some screens glowing as recordings started. She knew this was no longer just a small moment that would vanish. This could follow her. This could reach the world. Her fellow attendant stepped forward, trying to recover the moment. He bent slightly, toward Keanu and Denzel, offering more drinks with a shaky smile. His voice cracked as he said, "Is there anything else we can get for you, sir?" But Keanu only shook his head, his attention still on Denzel. His message had already been spoken. There was no need for more. The truth was already alive in the air. Passengers whispered to each other. Some were ashamed. Some were nervous. The teenagers who had laughed earlier now sat stiff, their phones lowered, their smiles gone. They glanced at Denzel, then quickly looked away, regret flickering in their eyes. The man in the suit who had called Denzel's bag Junk cleared, his throat loudly as if trying to cover his unease, but he too said nothing. The staff gathered at the front of the cabin for a quiet conference, their faces tight with worry. One hissed under their breath. "Do you know who that is? That's Keanu Reeves. He's recording this in his head. This could go everywhere." Another bit her lip. "We need to fix this now." They all knew the airline's reputation could collapse in a single night if this reached the news. They knew the cameras of passengers were already capturing their shame. The captain's voice broke over the speaker then, calm but slightly forced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience. Please enjoy the remainder of your flight." It was a distraction, a weak attempt to smooth over the tension, but the cabin wasn't ready to move on. The passengers had seen too much. Back at his seat, Denzel lifted the bottle and sipped slowly. His throat cooled, but more than the water, it was the kindness that healed him. He turned his head slightly, his lips parting to whisper, "Thank you," to Keanu. His voice was almost lost in the hum of the engines, but Keanu heard it. He nodded once, not with pride, but with quiet reassurance, as if to say, "You deserve it." The attendants returned with nervous energy, offering snacks and drinks to rows they had ignored earlier. They smiled too wide, their voices too sweet, trying desperately to cover the cracks. But no one forgot. The passengers who had laughed earlier could not meet Denzel's eyes. The ones who had stayed silent shifted in their seats, their guilt heavy. Even those who had done nothing wrong felt changed. The young attendant who had been rude to Denzel finally approached him. Her hands shook slightly as she bent down, her voice lowered, almost whispering, "Sir, I'm sorry." The words were stiff, her shame mixed with fear. She did not apologize because she wanted to. She apologized because she was forced to. Denzel looked at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. He gave a small nod. He did not say much. He didn't need to. For him, the apology mattered less than the moment Keanu had given him. Keanu sat quietly, his presence still commanding respect without effort. He had not shouted. He had not demanded punishment. He had only demanded dignity, and in doing so, he had shaken the staff to their core. They knew that his words would echo far beyond this cabin. They knew that their uniforms, their airline's name, could soon be tied to shame across the internet. The air was restless now. Passengers began to murmur again, but the sound was different. No more cruel jokes, no more laughter at Denzel. Instead, it was soft talk about respect, about kindness, about how one person's voice had stopped the cruelty. People glanced at Keanu with quiet admiration. Some lifted their phones, pretending to check messages but secretly recording him. The airline staff caught those movements and flinched. Their hands wrung together. They whispered about reporting to the captain, about writing an incident log. They knew it was too late. The story was already being written in the minds of everyone on board. Denzel sat straighter now, his shoulders less heavy, the bottle of water still in his hand. He didn't drink much, but just holding it made him feel stronger. He looked around the cabin, and for the first time, the eyes that met his were not filled with mockery but with shame or sympathy. He felt warmth spread in his chest. He had been humiliated, yes, but he had also been defended, and that defense was more powerful than the cruelty had ever been. The attendants, meanwhile, could not shake the fear. They imagined headlines. They imagined their manager waiting at the airport. They imagined their faces in videos shared across millions of screens, the calm voice of Keanu Reeves replayed in their ears. Respect should never be a mistake. Those words clung to them. Like a brand, the plane carried on, high above the clouds, but inside, the staff walked more carefully, spoke more softly. Every movement was watched, every choice judged. They were no longer in control of the cabin. Humanity was, and at the heart of it sat Keanu and Denzel, one man who refused to stay silent and one man who finally felt seen. Together, without knowing it, they had turned a simple flight into a lesson no one on board would ever forget. The flight moved steadily through the sky, but inside the cabin hearts were no longer the same. The silence that had once been filled with laughter at Denzel's expense now carried weight. People who had joined in the mockery kept their eyes down. People who had stayed silent shifted with guilt. Everyone knew the truth. They had all witnessed cruelty, and only one man had stood up to stop it. Denzel sat by the window, holding the small bottle of water. His hands still trembled slightly, but it was no longer from shame. It was from the overwhelming feeling that someone had cared. He replayed Keanu's words in his head. Respect should never be a mistake. The sentence echoed, washing away some of the bitterness in his chest. For years, Denzel had felt invisible. Yet here, on this plane, in front of strangers, someone had defended him with dignity. His heart swelled, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. Keanu sat calmly in his seat, his cap tilted low. He wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't waiting for applause. He had done what he believed was right. For him, humanity was simple. You see injustice, you stop it. He leaned back slightly, but his presence still filled the cabin. The passengers couldn't ignore him. They couldn't ignore the truth he had spoken. A small child sitting across the aisle tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why was that man mean to him?" The mother's face flushed. She glanced nervously at Denzel, then at Keanu, and softly replied, "Because sometimes people forget to be kind, but we must always remember." Even children felt the shift. The lesson was spreading quietly. The teenagers who had laughed earlier sat stiff, their phones tucked away now, their faces pale. One finally muttered to the other, "We shouldn't have done that." The other nodded slowly, guilt heavy in his eyes. They had mocked Denzel for being different, but now they saw him through a new lens, through Keanu's eyes, as a man who deserved respect like anyone else. The man in the suit who had called Denzel's belongings junk pulled out his tablet and tried to bury himself in work. But his mind was restless. He felt the sting of shame each time he glanced toward the quiet man by the window. He had prided himself on his status, his wealth, his polished shoes. Yet in that moment, he felt small compared to the dignity of the man he had humiliated and the humility of the man who had defended him. Slowly, conversations began to change. Passengers whispered about kindness, about respect. Some even shared stories of their own. A woman in the back leaned toward her neighbor and said, "Once someone helped me when I was in trouble. I never forgot it." Another nodded and replied, "Maybe we should all remember moments like that." The cabin, once filled with mockery, now became a quiet classroom, a place where humanity was being taught not by rules but by example. Denzel felt eyes on him, but they were different now. They were no longer sharp or mocking. They were softer, some filled with apology, some with quiet respect. He lifted his head slightly, meeting those eyes without flinching. For the first time in a long time, he felt strong enough to do so. He wasn't invisible anymore. Keanu noticed this small change, the way Denzel's shoulders eased, the way his head lifted. It was a victory greater than any movie scene. He leaned slightly toward Denzel and spoke softly so only he could hear. "Don't ever think you're less than anyone here. You belong, always." Denzel's throat tightened. He whispered back, "Thank you. You don't know what this means." His voice cracked, but the gratitude in it was stronger than tears. The attendants continued their work more carefully now, their steps lighter, their voices quieter. They treated every passenger with forced politeness, but the weight of their earlier actions hung on them. They knew they had failed and no amount of smiles could erase it. Still they tried, because they had been reminded, painfully, of what their job truly meant, to serve with respect, not to judge. A ripple of change moved through the cabin. What began as one man's humiliation had become a mirror for everyone on board. People reflected on their own actions, their own silences. Keanu hadn't scolded them with anger, but his truth had pierced deeper than anger ever could. Humanity was not about grand speeches. It was about simple acts, about standing when others sat in silence. Denzel closed his eyes for a moment, but this time it wasn't to escape. It was to breathe in relief. He felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his chest. The cruelty had hurt, yes, but the kindness had healed. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his family's faces. He imagined telling them this story, not as a tale of humiliation but as a story of hope. Passengers looked at Keanu differently now too, not as a celebrity but as a man who practiced what many preached. He was living proof that fame meant nothing without humanity. His simple act had reminded them that kindness was always a choice, one anyone could make. The hum of the engines carried on, steady and calm, but inside something sacred had shifted. No one mocked anymore, no one whispered cruel words. Instead, they sat with their thoughts, each one touched in a different way. Each one reminded that dignity was not a gift, it was a right. Denzel sat straighter, no longer curling into himself. He held the bottle of water with steady hands now, not as a symbol of shame, but as proof that someone had cared enough to fight for him. His heart, once heavy, now beat with quiet pride, and Keanu, sitting calmly a few seats ahead, closed his eyes too, not to escape but to rest in the knowledge that sometimes one voice, one small act of courage could awaken an entire room. He had done what needed to be done, and in doing so, he had given everyone a lesson they would carry far beyond this flight. The plane finally began its descent. The captain's voice came through the speakers announcing the landing. Passengers straightened in their seats, buckling belts. Some sighed with relief, glad the flight was almost over. But for many, their thoughts were still heavy. The silence that followed Keanu's words had stayed with them. It was not the same silence of mockery. It was the silence of reflection, of shame, of lessons learned. Denzel sat by the window, the bottle of water still resting in his hands. His fingers had stopped trembling. His chest no longer felt as heavy as before. He breathed deeply, his eyes focused on the ground coming closer below. For him, this flight had been one of the hardest moments of his life, yet it had also become one of the most unforgettable. What had started as humiliation had turned into something else, something that gave him strength. When the wheels touched the runway and the plane slowed, people began to move again. Phones were switched on, bags pulled from under seats. The usual rush of passengers returning to their busy lives filled the air, but among the shuffle, whispers rose once more. Not cruel whispers this time, but murmurs of awe. "That was Keanu Reeves," someone said. "Did you hear what he said to the attendant?" Another whispered, "Someone recorded it. It's already online." Indeed, several passengers had quietly filmed the moment when Keanu stood up. Already messages and short clips were being sent to friends. Some were uploaded to social media within minutes of landing. The scene that had shaken the cabin was about to shake the world. As the doors opened and passengers filed out, Denzel moved slowly, clutching his bag close. The same bag that had been mocked now felt like no shame at all. He looked up once and caught Keanu's eyes. The actor gave him a small nod, gentle but full of meaning. It was not a nod of pity. It was a nod of respect. Denzel's lips trembled as he whispered, "Thank you." Again, though the noise of passengers almost drowned his voice, Keanu simply smiled softly and stepped aside, letting him pass first. Outside the gate, the airport buzzed with its usual chaos, people hurrying to catch connections, screens flashing flight updates, announcements echoing overhead. But soon, a different kind of buzz began. Passengers from the flight started sharing what they had seen. Some retold the story to waiting family. Some typed furiously on their phones, their words carried across the digital world. "Keanu Reeves defended a man from humiliation on our flight." Within hours, the story spread. Videos uploaded online gathered thousands of views, then millions. The clip of Keanu standing, his calm voice asking why Denzel was refused water, became a symbol. Comment sections filled with praise. "This is why Keanu is loved, not just as an actor but as a human being," one wrote. "The world needs more people like him." Another added, "The airline's name trended too, but not in pride. It trended in shame. People demanded answers. They demanded change." For Denzel, however, the biggest change was not online. It was inside himself. He walked through the airport with his head higher than before, his steps steadier. The weight of mockery had not disappeared, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the memory of someone who had cared enough to speak. For years, he had felt invisible, But on that flight, before strangers and cameras, his humanity had been defended. Back in the cabin, after most passengers had left, the flight attendants sat quietly, their faces pale, their voices low. They knew what was waiting for them. A report, maybe punishment. The shame of their actions would not disappear easily. They replayed Keanu's words in their heads. Respect should never be a mistake. That line would follow them for a long time, reminding them of the day they failed to show kindness. Keanu, meanwhile, walked calmly through the airport, blending in as always. He wore no proud smile, no sense of victory. To him, it was never about attention, never about going viral. It was about one man, one moment, one choice. He believed kindness was a duty, not an option. And so he simply carried on with his journey, leaving behind a wave of change he never asked for but always believed in. For the passengers who had witnessed it, the lesson would remain. Some would carry guilt for staying silent. Some would carry inspiration for speaking next time. But none of them would forget the moment the cabin fell silent to listen to one man's voice calling for dignity. Denzel reached the exit doors of the airport where his family waited. When his children saw him, they ran into his arms. His wife smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. He held them close, tears slipping from his eyes. He didn't tell them all, the details right away, but he knew he would. He wanted his children to know that even in dark moments, kindness could appear. He wanted them to grow believing that humanity was worth defending. The story spread far beyond that flight, reaching homes, offices, and streets across the world. People shared it with friends. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Strangers discussed it in cafes. It became more than a viral video. It became a reminder, a story of how one man's courage to speak could change the lives of many. And for Denzel, sitting later at home holding his children close, he whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for Keanu, but for the lesson he had received. That dignity could be restored, that humanity still lived, and that one voice could turn silence into hope. The plane had landed, but the journey of that moment was far from over. It would live on, not in the engines of a machine, but in the hearts of people who promised themselves never again to stay silent in the face of cruelty.